Good afternoon, and welcome to the PowerPoint lecture on Israel versus or Palestine. So basically, the core of the lack of peace in the Middle East, I guess would be the way to put it, stems from this issue of Israel and Palestine. And in order to understand it, of course, you have to kind of go back to the beginning. So that's what we're going to do here. A relatively brief uh, layout of Israel and Palestine. Okay, so you see some symbols. You in the lower right hand, you will see the United States shaking hand with the Israelis, and in between the Palestinians. You see in the upper left the cartoon that states, "You see, we're just defending ourselves," with a plethora of missiles, um, both of which really kind of highlights the problem for the United States in the Middle East. The problem is, of course, that we are one of the main allies of the Israelis, and the Israeli story is carved out of Palestinian or Arab territories. So the fact that we have the second largest Jewish population in the world, Israel is a Jewish state. Therein lies the problems that we have in the Middle East. We support them. They are surrounded by Arab, predominantly Muslim countries, and they are not fond of Israel, and they are not fond of the United States, who supports Israel. So, if we go back in history, you'll see on the left-hand side the historic land of Israel, and upper right shows you its location, the Rome time of Rome, and on the lower right shows you again Palestine or Israel's location, and the Islamic civilization that has grown around it. So if we start at the left-hand side, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob, another story with the Archangel Gabriel, has discussions with Gabriel, and Gabriel will rename Jacob Israel, and Israel will have 12 sons and will prosper. And the map of the 12 tribes of Israel, basically, is modern day Israel and some of the surrounding areas. So he and his 12 sons inhabit this region, and they bring the Hebrew faith to this region 2 to 3,000 years ago. Now you have to keep in mind that the original inhabitants of this area are just referred to as Arab, as being part of or near the Arabian Peninsula, or Semitic because of their language group, the Semites that share a common language, and in this case, they will speak Hebrew. However, much of the population at this time is not Hebrew; it's Arab, and herein lies the problem. So they have settled in that region, of course, and will thrive in that region over time, but they'll also be persecuted from the surrounding ethnicities, I guess would be the best way to put it, throughout their history. All right. So the history kind of goes back to a name that you're going to have to know for testing purposes is Theodore Herzl. So, as I said, the Jews or the Hebrews have been forced um, uh, from territories throughout their history. You can see on here, forced out of Israel by the Muslims. They were persecuted throughout history by the Russians. And then it culminates basically in the final diaspora or the scattering of the Jews during World War II in Nazi Germany. But Herzl has this idea of a Zionist movement, and that's what you need to know. The Zionist movement is this belief, the Hebrew belief, that at some point they will return to their chosen land. And their chosen land, of course, is where they originally carved it out, where Jacob or Israel originally carved it out with the 12 tribes in modern day the Middle East or the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean Sea. So that Zionist movement starts in about the 1880s, 70s perhaps, and then gains momentum over time. So know the name Herzl and know the phrase Zionism. All right. Now, most of you, if not all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the World War II story and the culminating event in Jewish history. Like I said, throughout a period of their history, they've been persecuted for various reasons, mainly of which because they believe strongly in education. So they have always been a very educated people, and they have always been relatively successful in the monetary systems or in the banking systems. And because of that, throughout history, when things go bad, a lot of times people will point to the Jewish people of the Jewish faith. Well, look at what they have, and why don't we have that? And we want that, and therefore the Jews will be targeted. And that has happened in many examples. The last of which, of course, is Nazi Germany. So remember, the Israelis flee during periods of the Roman Empire. They flee during periods of the Islamic or Muslim inhabitation of that region. Remember, Muhammad's not born until the 600 or 500s, 570 or 580, and therefore it's a relatively new belief system. But as Muslims populate and become more prominent in the region, more and more Hebrews or those of the Jewish faith will leave. The culminating event again is World War II, and the fact that Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler are going to scapegoat the Jews as part of the problem and try to create the final solution and eliminate those of the Jewish faith and other ethnicities. Brings the biggest amount of attention to the Jewish cause in history. Now, the two claims of the Islam of the Israeli territory is biblically the Jews claim it belongs to us. It was basically not a formulated state at the time of Jacob or of Israel, and the 12 tribes inhabited it. So that is basically our homeland. That's where we started. And the Muslims' claim is, or the Arab claim would be, well, we are all of that area or of that territory. And even before the Hebrews, there were people of Palestinian or Arab descent that inhabited that territory. So for you, it's basically based off of some of the evidence that you read or some of the things that you watch. You have to make that determination which side are you on? Who do you believe has the rightful claim? Okay, so World War II takes place. It ends. April, the Germans surrender. September, Japanese surrender, 45. And very soon after that, there's going to be unrest in modern day Israel, in that region. And throughout, since Herzl in the 1880s, this Zionist movement meant that people of the Jewish faith were moving back into this region. Now, during World War II, a lot of Jews are going to flee Germany and the surrounding areas, and they will make their way into Palestine because it wasn't known as Israel, and be part of some of the settlements, the Jewish settlements that are in this region. Now, after World War II, there is a new organization created, the United Nations. And the United Nations is basically a Western structure. The victorious Western nations of World War II and a scattering of other nations. And they are going to start to become involved in a world organization. So it's the United Nations that decides that they're going to try to create a solution to the problem between the Jews and the Palestinians. So they are going to divide up this territory, and they're going to give roughly half to the Israelis and roughly half to the Palestinian Arabs of that region. And you can kind of see on this map the breakdown of the territory, the partition plan of the United Nations. And this was theoretically supposed to appease both sides. You are giving a homeland both to the Jews and to the Palestinian people, and you have what you've been asking for, a state. Now, Jerusalem, the old city in yellow there, is basically going to be an international city, not belonging to either side. All right, what are we looking at here? So that was the original partition plan on the left, and then where we are today. Today, the green is Israel, modern day Israel. And you can see the dark green or the yellow, that used to be the dark green for the Palestinians' original state, is considerably smaller than it had been in the 1947 plan. And that is, herein lies part of the problem. A lot of the Palestinian territory has been occupied. And by occupied, I mean taken by the Jews. And there's a series of reasons why they take the land, but you can see it's considerably smaller for the Palestinian people. All right. And again, this kind of shows you 1946, what prior to the United Nations getting involved, what it looked like. And then you saw what it looked like for the actual partition plan. And then what it's going to look like after what's called the 6-Day War. The 6-Day War, the Israelis really make the land grab. You can see a significant amount of territory that was taken after a war in 1967. And yes, I was born. Thank you for asking. And then again, 2005 are roughly what it looks like today. Again, green representing Palestinian territory. All right. So, of the Palestinian territory that remains, there's two main areas, Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So you can see Gaza here. It used to be pretty significantly larger, so did the West Bank. So it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. So this is the Jordan River, and it's west of the Jordan River. They call it the West Bank. And these are the predominant territories of Palestinians today. So, Gaza Strip. Um, The uh, the Jews in the West Bank have continued over the years when there's any conflict to build more and more settlements. All right. And when they build these settlements, of course, they are taking land away from the Palestinians and giving it to Jewish settlers. So the West Bank has a government for the Palestinians, and that government um, sits on behalf to make decisions for the Palestinian people. Gaza has its own government, and its government has a group, this is here, this Muslim fighting group known as Hamas. Well, Hamas has become the majority or a large percentage of the government officials in Gaza. So really you have two separate governments. You have the Palestinian Authority, it's called, in the West Bank. And then you have Gaza that has its own government, but it's much, much more radical than the Palestinian Authority. So Hamas uses all these tactics, still does to this day, to try to uh, fight against what they consider the occupying force of Israel, the Israelis. The West Bank, there is violence in the West Bank. There is friction between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis, but for the most part, uh, they try to live harmoniously, and the Palestinian Authority wants to be recognized as a legitimate state at some point. All right. So here's where the United States comes in. So I've said before, we have the second largest Jewish population in the world, second only to Israel. And Israel is a democracy, one of the few democracies in the region that is democratically elected officials, um, free market, not a monarchy like many of the countries, the other Muslim countries around it. All right. And because we support this democracy wholeheartedly, the vast majority of the countries within that region dislike us. So, Palestinians, West Bank, we're on decent terms. Gaza, no. As an American, you are not going to go to Gaza and be a tourist. So, there is friction throughout the region because of the United States support of Israel. All right. Israel's recognized country name. It's almost like our border wall. They have created barriers between the West Bank and the occupied territories or the settlements that they've created. They will fence them in, they will wall them in. Gaza is basically just it's a large population in an incredibly small place, and those are the radical, what we would consider, the West would consider the radicals of Hamas that populate most of Gaza Strip. Last year or 2 years ago, uh, President our President Trump moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. Now, historically, or since the Six-Day War anyway, Jerusalem was supposed to be left alone. It's just an international city, not claimed by either side. But the Palestinians took Jerusalem as their capital. And the Israelis, for a long period of time, chose a city called Tel Aviv as their capital. But over time, or after the Six-Day War, they are going to take Jerusalem as their capital. Now, the United States kind of stayed out of that. We always kept our embassy in Tel Aviv until President Trump. So President Trump showed strong support for the Jewish cause and a lack of support for the Palestinians by moving our embassy to Jerusalem. That was incredibly controversial, but again, President Trump wanted to show a sign of strength in our relations between the Jews and the United States and limit the support for the Palestinians. So the question are, what are the Israelis and Palestinians fighting over? Well, ultimately it's territory and who has the rightful ownership of that territory. And again, based on which side you were born into or moved to, or kind of skews uh, what you think is right or wrong. So you guys get the opportunity to look at it in a more objective manner. So you've got a video that you need to watch for tomorrow and answer a couple of questions that should give you some insight, because you get to listen to some actual Palestinians and some Jews talking about the topic. You've had some reading already on the debate. I've told you what the United States, at least in recent history, has done, and historically, we've been the avid supporter of Israel because of the fact that they're a democratic, capitalist, free market economy, right? Surrounded by monarchies and dictatorships, the like Arab Muslims. So you get to make that determination for yourself. And I believe you should have a question or two in your assignments. You don't necessarily have to have it for this assignment or for this PowerPoint. This is just informational. But you do need to be able to have an opinion on who has the rightful right to this territory. All right, that is going to be it for